A quiet suburban street. Claire hurries to check her mail as her neighbor Karen watches intently. Suddenly, Karen grabs a can of paint and defiantly covers Claire's mailbox. Unaware the whole scene is being captured on a hidden federal postal camera. What happens next will change everything. Claire hummed softly to herself as she stepped outside, the warm morning sun casting long shadows across her lawn. She quickly made her way to the end of the driveway, eager to collect the day's mail. But as she approached the mailbox, she froze in her tracks. A fresh coat of shiny blue paint covered the once pristine white surface. Claire's heart raced as she stared in disbelief. "What the?" she began, before the unmistakable sound of paint came clattering to the ground made her spin around. There stood her neighbor, Karen, a paintbrush still in hand and a wild expression on her face. "Oh, hi, Claire," Karen called out, feigning innocence. "I was just giving your mailbox a little makeover. I thought the color needed a refresh." Claire's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. "Refresh? You painted over my mailbox without my permission," she snapped, marching over to Karen. "This is federal property. You can't just—" "Oh, calm down," Karen interrupted, rolling her eyes. "It's not a big deal. I was just trying to help spruce the place up a bit. Your mailbox was an eyesore." "That's not your decision to make," Claire shot back, her voice rising with indignation. She glanced down at the ground, spotting the half-empty paint can. "You're going to clean this up and repaint it back to the original color. Immediately." Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "Fine, fine. If it means that much to you." She bent down, grabbing the can. "But I think the blue looks so much nicer. It really pops against the green of your lawn." Claire clenched her fists, struggling to contain her anger. "I don't care what you think. This is my property, Karen. You had no right to." "There you go again, always making a big deal out of nothing," Karen interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "Just lighten up, will you? It's not the end of the world." Before Claire could respond, the sound of an engine approaching made them both turn. A white postal van slowly rolled to a stop right in front of them, the driver's side window sliding down to reveal a stern-faced postal worker. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the mailbox," the worker said, his tone clipped and authoritative. Karen's eyes widened, her confident demeanor instantly crumbling. "What? Why?" she stammered. The postal worker fixed her with a hard stare. "Federal law prohibits any unauthorized tampering with United States Postal Service property," he stated matter-of-factly. "We have the entire incident on camera." Claire felt a surge of triumph as she watched the color drain from Karen's face. "But I was just trying to," Karen began, only to be cut off by the postal worker. "Save it. I'm placing you under arrest for destruction of federal property." He reached for his radio, calling for backup as Karen stood frozen in shock. Claire couldn't help the small smile that crept across her lips. Justice was about to be served. The sound of sirens in the distance only added to the growing tension as the postal worker calmly radioed for backup. Karen's face had gone a sickly shade of pale, her eyes darting around frantically as if searching for an escape route. "Please, there's no need to call the police," she pleaded, her voice quivering. "I was just trying to, spruce things up a bit. I didn't mean any harm." The postal worker fixed her with an unyielding stare. "Ma'am, you're on federal property and you've been caught on camera vandalizing government-owned equipment. That's a serious offense." Claire couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction at Karen's obvious distress. After years of putting up with her overbearing, judgmental neighbor, this was a long overdue comeuppance. "But I'm sure we can work something out," Karen continued, her desperation palpable. "I'll pay for the damages, or you can just let me off with a warning. Please, I'm begging you." The postal worker's expression remained unmoved. "I'm afraid that's not possible, ma'am. You're under arrest." Before Karen could protest further, the wail of sirens grew closer, and 2 police cruisers pulled up behind the postal van. 2 officers quickly exited the vehicles, approaching the scene with purpose. "What's the situation here?" one of the officers asked, his gaze shifting between Karen and the postal worker. This woman was caught on camera vandalizing a United States Postal Service mailbox, the postal worker replied, gesturing towards the fresh paint job. "I'm placing her under arrest for destruction of federal property." The officers quickly moved to apprehend Karen, who was now openly weeping and pleading for mercy. Claire watched in grim satisfaction as they cuffed her hands behind her back and led her towards the waiting police cars. "No, please. This is all a misunderstanding," Karen cried out, the desperation in her voice tugging at Claire's conscience, if only for a moment. But then Claire remembered all the times Karen had looked down on her, criticizing her yard work or the state of her home. The way she'd always acted so superior, as if she were somehow better than everyone else on the street. In that moment, Claire felt no sympathy. As the officers pushed Karen into the back seat of the cruiser, Claire couldn't resist the urge to call out, "Looks like you're the one who needs a makeover now, Karen." The smug satisfaction on Claire's face quickly faded, however, when she noticed the postal worker approaching her, a serious expression on his face. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us as well," he said, his tone brooking no argument. Claire's heart sank. "What? Why?" she asked, the panic rising in her voice. "I didn't do anything wrong." The postal worker held up a hand. "We have you on camera as an accessory to the crime. You'll need to come down to the station and give a statement." Claire opened her mouth to protest, but the sound of the sirens drowned out her words as the officers ushered her into the back seat of the second police car. As the vehicle pulled away, she couldn't help but wonder what other surprises this day had in store. The ride to the police station was a blur for Claire. Her mind raced with a whirlwind of emotions: disbelief, anger, and a touch of trepidation. How could she be considered an accessory to a crime she had nothing to do with? As the police car pulled into the station's parking lot, Claire's heart sank. This was not how her day was supposed to go. She should be at home, enjoying her morning coffee, not sitting in the back of a squad car, about to be interrogated. When the officer opened the door, Claire hesitated for a moment before stepping out. "Look, officer, there's been a mistake," she pleaded. "I had nothing to do with what Karen did. I was just as shocked as you were." The officer held up a hand, silencing her. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but you'll need to come with me and give your statement. The postal inspector wants to speak with you." Claire reluctantly followed the officer into the station, her mind racing. How could this be happening? She was the victim here, not the criminal. As they passed through the bustling lobby, Claire couldn't help but feel the curious stares of the other officers and civilians. Once inside a small, sterile-looking interview room, the officer motioned for Claire to have a seat. "The postal inspector will be with you shortly," he said, before exiting and closing the door behind him. Claire sank into the chair, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. This was all happening so fast. One minute she was simply checking her mail, the next she was being hauled in for questioning. The sound of the door opening jolted her from her reverie. A tall, stern-looking man in a crisp uniform strode into the room, his gaze fixed on Claire. "Ma'am, I'm Postal Inspector Johnson," he said, taking a seat across from her. "I understand you were present during the incident with your neighbor, Karen." Claire nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, that's right," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. "But I had nothing to do with what she did. I was just as shocked as you were when she painted over my mailbox." Inspector Johnson regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "That may be true," he said, "but the footage we have from the postal camera shows you in close proximity to the vandalism." Claire felt her stomach twist into knots. "But I didn't do anything," she protested. "I was just trying to get her to stop and fix it. You have to believe me." The inspector leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to be completely honest with me. Did you have any prior knowledge of your neighbor's intentions? Claire shook her head vehemently. No, of course not. I had no idea she was going to do something like that. Inspector Johnson studied her for a moment, his gaze seemingly piercing through her. Well, your story checks out so far, he said, his tone softening slightly. But I'm going to need you to provide a detailed statement of everything that happened. Claire let out a shaky breath, nodding in agreement. As she began to recount the events of the morning, she couldn't help but wonder how much deeper this rabbit hole might go. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she recounted the morning's events to the postal inspector. She meticulously described how she had been going about her routine, simply checking the mail, when she had stumbled upon Karen's inexplicable act of vandalism. And you had no prior knowledge or involvement in your neighbor's actions. The inspector pressed, his gaze unwavering. Absolutely not, Claire insisted, her voice tinged with frustration. I was just as shocked as you were when I saw her painting over my mailbox. I had nothing to do with it. The inspector nodded slowly, his expression giving away little. I see. And what happened after you confronted your neighbor? Claire took a deep breath, the memory of the confrontation still fresh in her mind. Well, I immediately told her to stop and that she had no right to be tampering with federal property. But she just brushed me off, acting like it was no big deal. And that's when the postal worker arrived on the scene, the inspector prompted. Yes, that's right, Claire replied. The postal worker pulled up and told Karen she was under arrest for destruction of federal property. He said they had the whole thing captured on camera. The inspector leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. And at that point, you made a comment towards your neighbor. Claire felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. I may have made a sarcastic remark about her needing a makeover now that she was the one being arrested, she admitted, her voice lowering. The inspector regarded her with a measured expression. I see. So you did engage with the suspect in some capacity, even if you claim to have had no prior involvement. Claire felt her heart sink. But I was just the victim here, she protested. Karen was the one who committed the crime. I was just standing up to her, the same way I've had to do for years because of her constant bullying and harassment. The inspector held up a hand, silencing her. I understand your frustration, ma'am, but the fact remains that you were present at the scene and made a statement that could be interpreted as antagonistic towards the suspect. Claire opened her mouth to argue further, but the inspector raised a hand. Look, I'm not saying you're necessarily guilty of anything, but I do need to take your statement and determine the full extent of your involvement, if any. Claire felt a surge of indignation, but she forced herself to take a calming breath. Okay, fine. I'll tell you everything I know. But I swear, I had nothing to do with what Karen did. I was just an innocent bystander caught up in this whole mess. The inspector nodded, his expression softening slightly. I appreciate your cooperation, Ms. He paused, glancing down at the papers in front of him. Claire, just tell me exactly what happened, from your perspective, and we'll go from there. As Claire launched into her detailed account, she couldn't help but wonder how much more complicated this situation was going to get. One thing was certain, her quiet morning had taken an unexpected and decidedly unpleasant turn. The interview with the postal inspector felt like it had gone on for hours, with Claire recounting every detail of the morning's events. She was determined to make him understand that she was an innocent bystander, caught up in her neighbor's unlawful actions. So just to be clear, Miss Claire, the inspector said, his brow furrowed in concentration, you had no prior knowledge of your neighbor's plan to vandalize your mailbox, and you did not in any way assist or encourage her in doing so. Claire shook her head emphatically. Absolutely not. I was just as shocked as you were when I saw her painting over my mailbox. I immediately told her to stop and that it was illegal, but she just brushed me off. The inspector nodded, jotting down a few notes. And your comment about her needing a makeover. That was simply a sarcastic remark in the heat of the moment, correct? Yes, that's right, Claire replied, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. I was just angry and frustrated that she was getting away with this. I didn't mean anything by it. The inspector studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Well, Miss Claire, I have to say, your story seems to check out. The postal camera footage corroborates your account, and your neighbor has been less than cooperative in her own interview. Claire felt a wave of relief wash over her. So, does that mean I'm free to go? She asked tentatively. The inspector held up a hand. Not quite yet. While I don't believe you were directly involved in the vandalism, I do still need to determine the extent of your knowledge and potential complicity. Claire's heart sank. But I've already told you everything I know, she protested. The inspector raised a placating hand. I understand your frustration, Ms. Claire. However, as a federal agent, I have a responsibility to conduct a thorough investigation. There are still a few more questions I need to ask you. Claire let out a resigned sigh, bracing herself for another round of interrogation. All right, fine. What else do you need to know? The inspector leaned forward, his gaze intense. Well, for starters, I'd like to know a bit more about your relationship with your neighbor, Karen. From what I gather, you two haven't exactly seen eye to eye on things. Claire felt a surge of irritation. That's putting it mildly, she muttered under her breath. Straightening in her chair, she launched into a detailed account of the long-standing feud between herself and Karen. She's always been judgmental and condescending, looking down on me and the rest of the neighborhood, Claire explained, her voice tinged with bitterness. She's constantly criticizing my yard work, the state of my house, even the way I dress. I'm sure she thought she was helping by painting over my mailbox, the same way she thinks she's helping by sticking her nose in everyone else's business. The inspector listened intently, his expression pensive. I see. And have you ever confronted her about her behavior before? Claire nodded, her jaw clenching. Of course I have. But she just brushes me off or tries to play the victim. Nothing I say ever gets through to her. The inspector leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. Interesting. And did you ever consider taking legal action against your neighbor for harassment or nuisance? Claire felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. Well, no. I never really thought it was worth the trouble, you know. I just tried to ignore her and avoid confrontation as much as possible. The inspector's gaze remained fixed on her, his expression unreadable. I see. Well, Miss Claire, I appreciate your honesty and cooperation. I'll need to review the evidence and confer with my colleagues before making any final determinations. Claire felt her heart sink. So what happens now? She asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. The inspector stood up, gathering his notes. For now, I'm going to have to ask you to remain here at the station until we've completed our investigation. We may need to speak with you again. Claire's eyes widened in alarm. But I haven't done anything wrong, she protested. The inspector held up a hand. I understand your frustration, Ms. Claire. But as I said, this is a federal investigation, and we need to ensure we've covered all our bases. I'll have an officer escort you to a private waiting area for the time being. As the inspector left the room, Claire felt a growing sense of dread. What had started as a simple morning routine had spiraled into a nightmare, and she couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse before they got better. Time seemed to crawl by as Claire sat in the small, sterile waiting room, her mind racing with a whirlwind of thoughts. She couldn't believe she was being detained as part of a federal investigation, all because of her neighbor's reckless actions. With a heavy sigh, Claire leaned back in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her gaze fixed on the bland, institutional-looking walls. She couldn't help but wonder what was happening with Karen. Had she managed to talk her way out of the situation, or was she still being grilled by the postal inspector? The sound of the door creaking open made Claire sit up straight, her heart pounding. But instead of the stern-faced inspector, It was a young police officer who entered the room. "Miss Clare," the officer said, his tone measured. "The inspector would like to speak with you again." Claire felt a knot of dread form in the pit of her stomach as she followed the officer back to the interview room. As she stepped inside, she found the postal inspector waiting, his expression unreadable. "Please, have a seat," the inspector said, gesturing to the chair. Claire complied, bracing herself for the worst. "Miss Clare, I've reviewed the evidence, including the camera footage and the statements from both you and your neighbor, Karen," the inspector began, his voice level. Claire felt her heart race. "And?" she prompted, her voice barely above a whisper. The inspector paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "Well, I have to say, your account of the events aligns quite closely with what we've seen and heard. You were clearly an unwitting bystander in this situation." Claire felt a flood of relief wash over her. "So does that mean I'm free to go?" she asked cautiously. The inspector held up a hand. "Not quite yet," he replied, his tone somber. "While I don't believe you were directly involved in the vandalism, there are still a few concerns that I need to address." Claire's heart sank once more. "What concerns?" she asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. "Well, for one, your neighbor's statements have been less than cooperative," the inspector explained. "She's adamant that you were somehow complicit in her actions, and she's made some rather serious allegations against you." Claire felt her blood run cold. "What kind of allegations?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The inspector regarded her with a measured expression. "She's claimed that you've been harassing her for years and that you've threatened her on multiple occasions." Claire felt a surge of indignation. "That's completely absurd," she exclaimed. "Karen is the one who's been making my life miserable with her constant criticism and judgmental behavior. I've never threatened her, and I certainly didn't have anything to do with her vandalizing my mailbox." The inspector held up a hand, silencing her. "I understand your frustration, Ms. Clare. However, as I mentioned, this is a federal investigation, and we need to take any and all allegations seriously." Claire felt her heart sink. "So, what does that mean for me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The inspector let out a heavy sigh. "Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to detain you pending further investigation. We need to verify the claims made by your neighbor and ensure that there isn't any evidence of wrongdoing on your part." Claire felt a wave of panic wash over her. "But I haven't done anything wrong," she protested, her voice rising in desperation. The inspector's expression remained stoic. "I understand, Miss Clare. But as I said, this is a federal matter, and we need to follow proper protocol. An officer will escort you to a holding cell for the time being." As the young officer approached her, Claire felt her heart racing. This couldn't be happening. She was the victim here, not the criminal. But as the officer gently took her by the arm and led her out of the room, Claire couldn't shake the sinking feeling that her nightmare was only just beginning. As the officer escorted Claire to the holding cell, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She couldn't believe she was being detained, all because of her neighbor's malicious lies and the postal inspector's overzealous investigation. The small, dimly lit cell felt oppressive as Claire was ushered inside. She sank onto the hard metal bench, her head in her hands, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. "This can't be happening," she whispered to herself, the weight of her predicament crushing her. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, trapped behind bars like a common criminal. Time seemed to crawl by as Claire sat in the cell, her mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. What would happen to her? How long would she be forced to remain here? And what about her home, her job, her life outside these walls? The sound of the cell door creaking open jolted Claire from her reverie. She looked up to see the postal inspector standing in the doorway, a somber expression on his face. "Miss Clare, I apologize for the inconvenience, but we need to continue our investigation," he said, his tone measured. Claire felt a surge of anger bubbling up inside her. Investigation? What more do you need to investigate? She snapped. I've already told you that I had nothing to do with what Karen did. The inspector held up a hand, silencing her. I understand your frustration, but this is a serious matter. Your neighbor has made some very concerning allegations, and we need to ensure that there is no evidence to support them. Claire scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. You can't be serious. Karen is the one who committed a crime, and now she's trying to turn this around on me. The inspector's expression remained stoic. I assure you, Miss Claire, we are taking this matter very seriously. We have an obligation to investigate any and all claims, no matter how unfounded they may seem. Claire felt her frustration boiling over. But I'm the victim here, she cried, her voice echoing off the bare walls of the cell. Karen vandalized my property, and now you're treating me like a criminal. The inspector let out a heavy sigh. I understand your perspective, but the reality is that this is a complex situation. We need to gather all the facts before we can make any definitive conclusions. Claire felt her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. So what happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Well, for the time being, I'm afraid you'll need to remain here, the inspector replied, his expression grave. We'll be conducting a thorough search of your home and property, as well as speaking with any other witnesses or potential victims in the neighborhood. Claire's heart sank. But I haven't done anything wrong, she pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. The inspector simply shook his head. I'm sorry, Miss Claire, but those are the protocols we have to follow. We'll be in touch once we've completed our investigation. With that, the inspector turned and exited the cell, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts. As the heavy metal door clanged shut behind him, she felt a fresh wave of panic wash over her. How had her simple morning routine turned into this waking nightmare? And how was she going to prove her innocence when the system seemed determined to treat her like a criminal? Claire huddled on the hard bench, her arms wrapped around herself as she fought back the tears that threatened to consume her. She had to find a way out of this mess, no matter what it took. Days had passed since Claire was first detained at the police station, and the tension had only continued to build. The postal inspector's investigation seemed to drag on endlessly, with no sign of resolution in sight. As Claire paced the small confines of her holding cell, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of despair. The once pristine white walls now felt like a cage, a constant reminder of the injustice she was facing. Suddenly, the sound of the cell door creaking open drew her attention. Claire looked up to see the postal inspector standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Miss Claire, I'd like to speak with you, he said, his tone grave. Claire felt her heart skip a beat as she approached the inspector. Have you found something? She asked, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. The inspector let out a heavy sigh. We've completed our investigation, and I'm afraid the evidence paints a rather complicated picture. Claire felt her stomach twist into knots. What do you mean? She pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Well, it seems that both you and your neighbor, Karen, have been engaged in an ongoing pattern of harassment and retaliation against one another, the inspector explained, his brow furrowed in concentration. Claire opened her mouth to protest, but the inspector raised a hand, silencing her. Now, I know you've maintained your innocence, and the camera footage does support your version of events. However, we've also uncovered a history of verbal altercations, property disputes, and even a few incidents that suggest a potential for escalation. Claire felt her heart sinking. But I've never done anything wrong, she insisted, her voice laced with desperation. Karen is the one who's been making my life a living hell for years. I was just trying to defend myself and my property. The inspector regarded her with a measured expression. I understand your frustration, Miss Claire, but the reality is that both of you have contributed to this ongoing conflict. And when it comes to federal property, we have to take a firm stance, regardless of the circumstances. Claire felt a lump forming in her throat. "So, what does that mean for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The inspector let out a heavy sigh. "I'm afraid you're going to have to face some consequences for your actions, Miss Claire. While we can't prove you were directly involved in the vandalism, your history of conflict with your neighbor and your sarcastic remark at the scene do suggest a level of culpability." Claire felt a surge of panic coursing through her. "But I haven't done anything wrong," she cried, her voice echoing off the bare walls of the cell. The inspector held up a hand, silencing her. "I'm sorry, Miss Claire, but the law is the law. You're going to be charged with obstruction of a federal investigation and disorderly conduct. You'll be released on bail, but you'll have to appear in court to answer for your actions." As the gravity of the situation sank in, Claire felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, facing serious legal consequences all because of her neighbor's malicious lies and the postal inspector's narrow interpretation of the law. As the officer escorted her out of the cell and towards the processing area, Claire couldn't help but feel a sense of bitter irony. Karen had gotten away with her crime, while Claire was the one being punished for simply trying to defend herself. As she stepped out into the bright sunlight, Claire knew that the battle was far from over. She was determined to fight this injustice, no matter what it took. After all, she was the victim here, and she wasn't about to let the system bury the truth.